Welcome back to News Talk, 15 past the hour now. Coming up for you later in the program, what went wrong for the Burgundy and Gold in New Jersey over the weekend. We'll also have a preview of the Tampa game, a game that seemingly looms large for both the quarterback and the coach. Right now, though, let's get back to our conversation with University of Mary Washington political science professor Stephen Farnsworth, the recent co-author of the book, The Global President. I was fascinated to see Donald Trump and Ben Carson force CNBC into some format changes that will be for the next debate, for the next GOP presidential debate. I believe it's October 28th, not this week, but middle of next week. They're not huge, but they are changes that the two candidates and perhaps others who are on that chaotic conference call that the party pulled the plug on as things seemed to run off the rails. These were things that the candidates wanted. They wanted a 2-hour debate and not a 3-hour debate, and they insisted upon both opening and closing statements. Having done a lot of debates at the local and regional and state level, I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from you first. Your reaction to CNBC's decision to cave and give in to these front-running candidates.
Yeah, I think that when you have as big a field as you do with the Republicans right now, this is enormous. You can't get them all into one debate. Even now, with a few of them have dropped off, you still are probably going to be looking at a debate that's going to either have another JV debate or it's going to just not have the JV candidates appearing at all. When you have all those candidates on the stage, there are a lot of campaigns who think the only way they're going to get anything to say in the first 20, 30 minutes is if there is an opening statement. And so I think that the candidates themselves, and it wasn't just Carson and Trump who wanted that opening statement. It's also some of the smaller candidates who will, like Jim Webb on the Democratic side last time, complain about not getting much attention because they're further back in the pack. So there's no doubt about it. A lot of the candidates wanted these opening and closing statements, and you can understand why. This is a chance to be direct in terms of an unmediated way, not interrupted by questions, not interrupted by other campaigns, to say what you want. So there's no doubt about it. The campaigns are better off with this. I'm not sure that the audience is better off with it. Yeah. I'm not sure that the debate itself is more informative because of this. When you have a 2-hour debate and you're going to invest all that time in opening and closing statements, that's less time for questions. So I don't think that it's necessarily in the best interest of the people watching to have these opening and closing statements every time we do these debates. But there's no doubt about it. It's in the best interest of the campaigns. And the campaigns are really, as we see, very much driving the train. When you look at Trump, for example, you're seeing something that you never see in television. These Sunday talk shows, for example. You know, if you can't show up in the studio, you're not on the air.
Exactly.
Except if you're Donald Trump. Then you can just call in your PJs or whatever, and it doesn't matter. Exactly. If you're Trump and you're willing to talk to us, we'll deal with the phone interview. And that's just not the way it's usually done at Meet the Press and Good Morning America and all the other talk shows.
When people ask me if I invite somebody to do this show and they say, can I call in? I say, no, I want you here. It's more fun. I mean, it's how a conversation should be. Let's talk about these issues separately before we move on to our next topics. The 3 hours versus 2. I get that 3 hours is a long time to stand under the lights at a podium in a high-pressure situation. But newsflash, the presidency is draining. It is a long 4-year slog where the most important decisions that any individual on the planet makes are made by you, sometimes sitting alone at that famous desk in that famous office. So there's a risk, I think, that these guys telegraph weakness when they say, I can stand for 2 hours, but 3, no way. I am out of here after 2 hours and 1 minute. You know, they're auditioning for a pretty significant gig, aren't they? Don't they? Isn't there a double-edged sword quality to this ask on the part of the candidates?
Well, absolutely. But once again, you know, it is in the best interest of the campaigns. If you think about a debate that goes 3 hours long, you know, that's an increased opportunity for you to make a mistake.
Sure.
I mean, ultimately, campaigns are thinking not about winning debates, but how to avoid losing them.
Right.
I mean, those horrific moments where, for example, when Gerald Ford said that Poland wasn't under Soviet domination during the Cold War, you know, when You're No Jack Kennedy attack that Lloyd Benson levied against Dan Quayle in a vice presidential debate. When you look at those kinds of unforgettable moments.
Rick Perry, of course.
Rick Perry not being able to finish the sentence about all the government programs he wanted to eliminate. those kinds of things are the sort of things that you try to avoid. And so what you want to do as a candidate trying to handle a debate is figure out what the questions are and try to figure out how you would answer them. And if the longer this goes, the more random the questions might get. I mean, who should be on the new bill? Currency question for these candidates. They weren't expecting that one.
In the Democratic debate, I thought the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, I thought that was a very nuanced, complex, interesting question to pose. And for any campaign that hadn't wargamed that one in advance, that was a moment of real peril, particularly in a Democratic primary.
Yeah,
but lingering into the general too.
Well, and this is how we learn whether these candidates are really up to the job. I think when Lincoln Chafee says, well, it was 99-1 and my father died and so I ended up in the Senate, you know, well, it suggests he didn't really do his due diligence on some of these issues. Now, it's okay for a critic maybe to make that claim, but normally candidates don't make it about themselves. And the Lincoln Chafee pretty uneven performance in that debate, I think really raises questions about his suitability for the job. And debates can do that. And that's very important. But for the campaigns, and make no mistake about it, they're trying to avoid making mistakes. And so Trump and Carson both know that they will be very visible and very much the center of the conversation in 2 hours. But if it goes 3 hours, that's more of a chance for the Chris Christies and Rand Pauls, people further back in the field, to be heard and maybe land a blow that they wouldn't have had the time to say in a 2-hour debate. The
Democratic field is so much smaller than the Republican field, and more than half of the candidates running are in the 1% neighborhood. Is it possible that by the time any caucus goer in Iowa or primary voter in New Hampshire has an opportunity to make their voice heard, that this field will have shrunk from an already small 5 down to a really small 3 or 2?
Well, that's entirely possible. I think that that Jim Webb and Lincoln Chafee weren't heard from very much during the debate. For people who were not already in their camp, I don't think that either one of those campaigns really said all that much that would bring a lot of new support to those campaigns. I think a lot of people really see this as a Hillary versus Bernie competition, and that's going to be a problem for Martin O'Malley as well, the other Democrat running. But the good news about Iowa, from the point of view of the candidates back in the pack, is that it costs almost nothing to be a candidate there. You go to church suppers. If you can find somebody who will put you up for the night, you don't even have to pay for a hotel room. And so we've seen candidates in Iowa, campaigns that are really running on fumes. They're not running national campaigns, but within Iowa, all they really need to do is figure out a way to get a lunch, get a place to stay at night, and fill up the gas tank. And when you're talking about campaigning at that level, when you go from one community to the other, that doesn't require a lot of money. The problem is if you're going to do anything after Iowa. New Hampshire's a bit more expensive, of course, Boston media market and the like, but the real money starts when you start moving into, say, South Carolina and then, you know, Super Duper Tuesday, which would include Virginia on March 1st. So those are the places where if you don't have money and an operation set up well before New Hampshire, you're not going to be competitive. And so the question, I think, for Lincoln Chafee or Bobby Jindal on the Republican side is, you know, how much do you really want to spend time doing this without the kind of money that's going to propel you beyond Iowa? Maybe they say, maybe they don't. The reality is that there is a way to run in Iowa that costs very little. There's a report this morning that Joe Biden will decide in the next 48 hours. He may, if this report is true, he'll decide before Secretary Clinton goes before the Benghazi panel. I'm not sure why it would need to be the next 48 hours. You've got various deadlines for registration of candidacy and things like that, filing deadlines for the early caucus and primary states that are coming up. But I don't see why you can't wait until after the Benghazi hearing and see how it goes. The reason that you might plausibly go ahead is so that you can say that it wasn't in reaction to Benghazi. And I think that that might be the best reason that Biden might do it. But I think it's pretty clear that over the last several days, the efforts that the Biden team has put forward to make sure that other people don't commit to either the Clinton campaign or the Sanders campaign suggests that Biden is more likely than not to run. I think that we're going to look at another very visible candidate in the field before the next few days, because it's very easy to say no or very easy to hold off and just say, well, we'll see how things go. To try to speed the process up ahead of the Benghazi hearing suggests that there is I think, a great temptation to run. Before we wrap up, there remains significant pressure on
Congressman Paul Ryan, the GOP vice presidential nominee in 2012, to step forward and say, I'm willing to serve as the next speaker. There's, of course, all this talk about the Freedom Caucus, the so-called Freedom Caucus in the House, this group of ultra-conservative Republicans. And one article I read said, made the point that whenever there's a large majority, inevitably you get factions, and in a large body like the House, there are always people unhappy with the process. That said, some fairly convincing suggestion that we've never really seen anything like the House Freedom Caucus before in terms of the impact they're having and the stalemate this near civil war has brought about. Is that overstating, or is that where we are?
Well, it's very hard to govern 40 people who don't believe that government should even be open most of the time. And so when you have the Freedom Caucus that made life very difficult for John Boehner, they will make life very difficult for the next speaker, because presumably they don't have a majority in the Republican caucus, and so it won't be a member of the Freedom Caucus that ends up as speaker. So what you have here is a situation where there is a great disagreement among Republicans about how to go forward. It's very, very problematic for the Republicans, because in the chaos that you see in the Republican House right now, you really don't see any movement on any issues that Republicans care about. I mean, and that's only going to make the Freedom Caucus and their supporters in the primaries madder and madder. And so
more emboldened.
And more emboldened. And so, you know, this is a this gridlock inside the Republican caucus, not in Congress, inside the Republican caucus in Congress, is creating a catastrophic environment for the Republicans in 2016, because every establishment candidate, that is those people like Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Chris Christie or John Kasich, people who could be very viable general election candidates, are going to be sidelined in the conversation that moves more and more to the home turf of this Freedom Caucus. It's a real problem for the Republicans. And no doubt about it, John Boehner would like to go. He would like Paul Ryan to succeed him. But if Paul Ryan does replace John Boehner, he will be subject to at least as much grief as Boehner did. And so Ryan, quite wisely, says, why do I want to walk into a chainsaw?
You've got one group saying, I can make the trains run on time, and the other group is saying, train? I'm taking the car. Who needs trains?
That's about the size of it.
University of Mary Washington political science professor and author Stephen Farnsworth. Always great having you here. Lots to talk about. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Talk with you again next time. We've got an update for you on the hour's top stories and the work week forecast, and then the changing landscape when it comes to sports gambling in America.